Thank you, gentlemen. And if you have questions, please hand them in, and we'll try to get them answered. First question. This is for both of you, I believe. Is the Met Council predicting where people want to live and planning infrastructure accordingly? Or is the Met Council directing where and how they think people should live?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I think the Met Council is on the verge of trying to direct where it thinks people should live. I don't think it has done much of that in the past, but it's on the verge of doing it. That's what has happened in Portland. Myron, you're right, there are no overt regional planning agencies, but they're covert in California. They're called local area formation commissions, and they have had a huge impact on the housing markets there. We traditionally measure housing affordability using what's called median home price to median family income ratio, or price to income ratio. And in California, the price to income ratios are 6 to 10. Before any of this land use planning, the median home price throughout the United States, San Francisco, New York City, everywhere in the United States, was about twice median family income. Today in California, they're 6 to 10 times median family incomes, which means you can't afford to buy a house. In Oregon, they're about 4 times median family incomes. Here in the Twin Cities, they're 2.5 times. They're a little higher than they ought to be, but not so high that the housing is really unaffordable. So that's what I mean when I say you're on the verge of becoming unaffordable. Under the Thrive Plan, the planners are going to discourage single-family housing. They're going to encourage multifamily housing under the guise of that being more affordable. I don't think it is more affordable. I don't think it's more desirable. And as I say, most people prefer to live in a single-family home. The people who want to live in multifamily, you should build for it, no problem. Get rid of zoning, or relax the zoning, let them build for it, but don't subsidize it and don't restrict the single family, which I think is what the Metropolitan Council wants to do.
And the question was, is the council dictating where people should go?
Is the Met Council dictating where people should go because they think that's where they should go, or is it planning infrastructure because they think that's where people want to go?
I think that it's following what's happening on the ground. So I think you have all the people that are outside. We have a urban service area, and we've really not enforced it very much. We've allowed people to scatter beyond it. Now we have to build infrastructure to catch up with that. We have all these septic systems outside the urban growth boundary. They're going to fail and pollute the groundwater. We're going to have to send interceptors out there, and we're going to have to help with the lakes and water system. So I think we're kind of playing responsive ball. I think it would be nice if in the future we said, we've got this delicate water table. Maybe we should try to make sure that people develop on sewer systems so that they don't pollute the water table, particularly where we have sewer capacity in place. That would be, I think, a good idea. I also think that the Met Council, the state legislature decided 25 years ago that every community ought to provide for their fair share of affordable housing. I think that's a good plan. I think that in that sense that the council should be fulfilling that statutory obligation, and I think that would be a good thing. I don't think they are, but I think it would be a good thing. I think they're sort of, as my map showed, putting it mostly in the poor places and mostly in the poor suburbs, following the path of least resistance, like most places that have very segregated metropolitan areas.
Okay. How does high density relate to the crime rate?
I don't think that high density has a direct relationship to the crime rate. I think you have very dense, fancy neighborhoods and parts of New York and elaborate communities that have very low crime rates. I think you have poor, low density communities in Houston that have very high crime rates. I think partly it's an issue of racial segregation and the concentration of poverty. When you have lots of people that have very great problems, when they don't have jobs, when the schools are very bad, and you put them all in a comparatively small, narrow place, whether it's in the low-density neighborhoods of Houston or in the poor neighborhoods of North Minneapolis, I think you're going to have problems.
I agree, density is not necessarily determinant of crime or crime rates. It turns out a researcher named Oscar Newman years ago studied hundreds of thousands of blocks comparing architectural features to crime, and what he discovered was that certain architectural features make neighborhoods or buildings more inviting to crime. If you have multiple entries and exits, you're more inviting to crime. So he found if you have an alley behind your house somebody can break in the front door or the back door. That makes your home twice as vulnerable. Ironically, the urban planners today want to mandate more alleys behind houses. He found if you had cul-de-sacs that had provide fewer exits from your neighborhood, that would make your neighborhood less vulnerable to crime. Ironically, urban planners today want to outlaw cul-de-sacs. It turns out almost all the things that he found that made neighborhoods more criminogenic are things that urban planners want to mandate, and things that he found that made neighborhoods less criminogenic are things that urban planners want to forbid. So this is another case where urban planners are putting ideology or fads ahead of actual on-the-ground experience.
I'm going to ask this question, but I don't quite understand it. Does the Tesla Model S come in all-wheel drive? If you want to ask, that's fine.
No, but I will say that the Subarus, which are all-wheel drive, are now the cheapest car you can buy that have adaptive cruise control, collision avoidance, and lane keeping, which are three essential functions of a driverless car. Once a driverless car software is available on the market, you can take your 2014 or 2015 Subaru and simply with a software upgrade make it driverless. That's a little oversimplified, but I think that's going to happen.
This came from a planner. As a planner, I too agree with Mr. O'Toole that all too often planners try to dictate market by putting forth design, etc. But when a community or the residents in the community have certain desires and principles to protect in their interests, how do you balance that?
Well, the Houston model uses homeowner associations and deed restrictions. And it's a very flexible system. About half the neighborhoods in the city of Houston have active homeowner associations and deed restrictions. If you live in a neighborhood that doesn't have them, you can petition your neighbors, and if 75% agree, you can start a new homeowner association and write your own deed restrictions. The deed restrictions range from very strict, where you are limited as to what color you can paint your house, to very loose. Some of them allow you to leave rusty pickup trucks on your front lawn. So it's up to your own neighborhood and neighborhood association to decide what you want to do, and the system can evolve. If a developer says, you know, you live in kind of an old neighborhood and we want to upgrade it, we want to change it, we'll come and we'll pay you to change your deed restrictions so that we can change it. Neighborhood associations have voted to do that as well and allow changes to happen. So it's a form of zoning. It's the kind of zoning that is controlled by you and your neighbors rather than downtown bureaucrats. And I feel a lot more, we've heard awful tales about homeowner associations, but I feel a lot more comfortable letting my neighbors join me in deciding what the future of my community is going to be than some urban planner who thinks that we ought to build apartments in my neighborhood.
I think, and I never really heard whether Randal agreed with me or not on this, and I'd be curious to know this, but I think that the zoning power is a limited power. It's limited by takings and equal protection and other constitutional authorities. So I think we have to be careful with this. I think when we exercise these powers, they should be by majority vote, so that the majority of the city, when it exercises. One of the things that worries me about homeowners association government is once the rules are set in place, it takes 2/3 of the people to change them.
Depends on the homeowner association.
But by and large, I looked at a survey of homeowners associations by Robert Ellison, who's a professor at Yale, and about 3/4 of them have 2/3 vote. So it's hard to change them. So once you set that in place, these homeowners associations, it's hard for local democracy to work. It's hard for the people to decide whether they want to change anything. I also think that, like James Madison said in the Federalist number 10, is there's a problem with faction. I think sometimes we need a balance. He said expand the sphere sometimes. Sometimes local communities are enraged by a passion, or they lose control, or a faction can take over. I know when I was in politics, almost every big change in the neighborhood was opposed, whether it was a movie theater that everyone loves now, they hated at the time, or whether there was a new apartment building coming in at the corner that they didn't want. So I think that sometimes James Madison was right in Federalist number 10, that sometimes our factions get out of control. We lose our reason a little bit, and we need to balance that. And sometimes those factional oppositions to a private market builder who wants to build an apartment building, or somebody that wants to build a shopping mall or something in a neighborhood, I think sometimes those interfere with property rights. Those interfere with other constitutional rights. and that they should be limited in a certain sense, that the market has to operate. We shouldn't let local NIMBYism, or as James Madison would say, faction, dictate the way that we develop all the time in every circumstance.
Myron Orfield only recited laws. What is his concept of market?
Well, I think that a metropolitan area, I think the census is, I would defer to the census in saying that a metropolitan area is a single housing market and employment market. And I think in some ways, we should try to organize ourselves to deal with that reality. And I think Mr. O'Toole says he very much likes Indianapolis. This is a city, single county government. I think they've decided that they do well there. Many of the border states south that are very, very successful economically, Lexington, Louisville, Raleigh, Knoxville, Nashville, all these tigers of growth, economic growth in the center of the country, don't have 187 units of government with land use planning powers. I wonder sometimes if we have 187 local units of government that are highly regulating the land, whether the market likes that, whether the market, the private market that is a single market in real estate and economic development, whether it thinks that we should have 187 local units of government making their own decisions in this and not necessarily liking each other or cooperating with each other. Maybe they should work together a little bit. Maybe it's time, like when we moved from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, to have something that recognizes all the important and beautiful parts of local government that de Tocqueville talked about, all the very important parts of democracy, that recognizes that we have to work together to create a more perfect union so that we can prosper in the future.
Well, I've talked markets, and Myron has asked me about my opinion on the laws, so let me talk about that for a second. I don't really have a serious problem with the 1926 Euclid decision, which the Supreme Court allowed modest zoning to protect, as a use of the police power of the state to protect against nuisances. I have a serious problem against the Penn Central, or with the Penn Central decision in 1976 that allowed governments to regulate land use based on personal preferences, basically. In that case, it was historic preservation, but basically if the government said, oh, your land is more valuable to us as open space than it is as a development, then you suddenly lose the rights to use your land because it's open space for somebody else. You don't get any benefit from it. And that has been legalized by the Constitution, or by the Supreme Court. I think it's much better to have 187 local governments competing against each other, trying to provide a land use and tax regime and regulatory regime that will attract more people and more business, rather than have some single government or regional government controlling them. NIMBYism is a problem only if there is no vacant, unregulated land around. So if you have 187 local governments, but you also have counties that have very little or no land use regulation, as they do in Texas, counties aren't allowed to do any land use regulation, then NIMBYism is not a problem at all, because if the governments become too regulatory, if the city governments become too regulatory, developers will just go walk out into the county and do what they want. That kind of competition encourages growth, it encourages opportunities, it allows people to build wealth rather than regulates people and businesses to death.
Mr. O'Toole, do you really think that there's no use for urban planning? Do you walk, do you drive, have you used a park, have you ever enjoyed a lake? Who do you think takes care of these things and makes them happen?
You know, I define government planning as I'm called the anti-planner. That's my blog. Look up anti-planner on Google, I'm the first thing on the list. The kind of planning I oppose are long-range government plans, because I don't think anybody can look that far in the future, any more than a year or two. I oppose comprehensive plans, where we try to plan for land use and transportation and zoos and waste disposal and electricity and everything else in one giant plan. And I oppose plans of other people's lands and resources. Now, we have road departments, they need to plan for where they're going to build a road. We have sewer departments, they need to plan where they're going to build sewers. Narrowly mission-specific plans that look ahead a short time period, I have no problem with. AT&T, CenturyLink, all of these local utility companies, Excel and so forth, are having to plan what they do, but they write short-term plans. They don't know what's going to happen in the long term. They don't lock themselves into plans. They allow them some flexibility. When government writes long-term plans, as soon as they're written, special interest groups spring up who are going to benefit from those plans and try to lock them in so that they can't change, even if they prove to be failures, as they have proven in Portland and San Francisco. So that's the kind of planning I oppose. I think we'd probably be better off if some of the things that are now public are privatized, but that's a different question.
Cities and counties do not have the financial resources to meet fair share goals, housing goals in 15 years. How can cities meet these goals?
I think one of the things we've said to these communities a lot of times is we've given them goals, but we've put all the resources in a different place. So we give a lot of suburban communities big goals, but then we dedicate all the housing resources to the poorest neighborhoods. I think if we dedicated the housing resources to achieve the goals, I think that we'd do a good job. I think we used to do a good job. But if you say, if one agency says, here, Medina, you have to do all this, and then they dedicate all the housing resources to the poorest neighborhood of Minneapolis, they're not going to achieve that goal. And I think that these suburban developers, one thing I think Randal might agree with me with, again, I don't want to put words in his mouth, is I think the private market housing developers who build affordable housing do it a lot more efficiently than the big, heavily government-supported ones in the central cities. When you look at the people that are building this housing in the suburbs, they're private market developers, and they're building it for a third less per square foot than the big government agencies in the city. And I say, God bless those people. We should give them more of the resources, because the private market out there in the suburbs is doing a more efficient job at getting these units everywhere. And we should try to make sure these subsidies go to these private market developers who want to do the right thing.
I think we should stop trying to build affordable housing and instead try to make housing affordable. I think we should realize that housing is one area where trickle-down economics does work. You build a house for a wealthy or a middle-class person. Eventually that house gets a little older. The middle-class person moves to a newer house, and a little bit less fortunate person or less well-off person buys the used house. Inner ring suburbs are being increasingly occupied by lower middle-class people. Outer ring suburbs are occupied by wealthier people. That's a natural process. The idea that outer ring suburbs should have housing as cheap as inner ring suburbs or as the inner cities is silly. We don't need to have a perfect mix of incomes in every single community. We just need to make the general level of housing affordable. And frankly, I'd like to live in places that have people with my income levels, because then I can shop in places that cater to people with my income level. If I were a poor person, I wouldn't want to live in a neighborhood where the only store is a Whole Foods. If I were a wealthy person, I wouldn't want to live in a neighborhood where the only store was a Walmart. So some income segregation is natural, because people naturally segregate themselves by incomes because they come to use the services and goods that are found in neighborhoods that have people with those tastes and incomes.
What affordable housing is being built in Detroit today? Detroit is filled with vacant homes.
Yeah,
Isn't that affordable housing?
yes. I think this is a great example, and I think if you wanted to go to a place that was a pretty free marketplace, where there were no regional planners, where there was no regional conception of the world, where every local government was the most powerful in the country, it'd be Detroit. And Detroit is a very segregated city. It's the most segregated city in the country, and there's lots of affordable housing in Detroit. The houses are, you can't give them away. At the height of the boom, the average house, even at the peak of the market, was, the average house, the price of a house in Detroit was less than the price of a car in the city, even before the boom. And this is what's happening in North Minneapolis too, and this is what's happening in Cleveland, and this is what's happening in the poorest neighborhoods of the city. When you create a deeply segregated, isolated neighborhood, you're going to have lots of affordable housing. You're also going to have terrible schools and bad health, and people that are moving in the wrong direction, like they are in Detroit. Louisville, Kentucky was a place that was working together at the same time Detroit wasn't. There were places that had similar demographics in terms of race, similar levels of segregation, similar levels of inequality. Louisville worked together as a region. It's prospering now. It doesn't have these neighborhoods like Detroit. It's growing and competing in the world economy. Louisville decided to work together, and it's prospering because of it. Detroit decided everyone had power, and everyone could fight everyone, and no one could cooperate. And it's a result that is predictable.
Well, Detroit is an outlier, and I don't think the Twin Cities has to worry about becoming like Detroit. I don't think any other city in America has to worry about it. The Detroit metropolitan area is actually thriving. It's doing very well. The suburbs are doing very well, but because of a corrupt city government, the city of Detroit is doing very poorly. So if you have to be wary of anything, it's wary of things that lead to urban corruption, such as the construction of giant urban monuments that require lots of subsidies and things like that, that I think tend to create corruption. I don't know if that's going to turn Portland into a Detroit. I hope not, but that's probably the biggest worry you have to figure.
Last question. Is there anything the two of you agree on?
I suspect there's a lot we agree on.
Come up with one.
Come up with one?
Is that the answer?
I had a couple of thoughts. I can ask you to come to
You believe in limited zoning, and I can live with very limited zoning. I would like to have very limited zoning. Basically, zoning in most American cities has historically been responsive to the market. If somebody wants to build something, they'll be responsive to that, and it works fine in places like Raleigh and even the Twin Cities and just about everywhere outside of Texas where they don't have zoning. So I don't have any problem with limited zoning. It's when you start becoming really prescriptive and saying, okay, we're going to change your neighborhood from single-family homes into multi-family housing because we decided that's better for you.
I think, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Randall, but I think that we agree that the zoning power is limited by other constitutional provisions like the Takings Clause and the Equal Protection Clause and substantive due process. So we think that zoning is limited by the Constitution of the United States in certain regards. We also, I think, both agree that the market should be free to respond to build apartment buildings if the market wants to, and that no community should use their zoning powers to discriminate against people that they don't like.
I don't have any problem with that.
So there is some agreement.
Thank you.
Anyone have any additional questions? I'm sure they, you can just come up here and we'll continue the discussion.